It's pretty wild when you stop and think about it. How do these massive traditional organizations actually adapt to shocking new realities? Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack Olivier Schmitt's fascinating insights into military strategy. We're going to break down the actual nuts and bolts mechanics of how armies evolve in a world that is just rapidly, constantly changing.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, the shock of war. Second, the challenge of change. Third, the anatomy of military strategy. Fourth, innovation versus adaptation. And finally, the trillion-dollar future.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the shock of war, which is all about what happens when theory smacks face first into reality.
Schmitt uses the image of a chameleon here, and it hits the nail right on the head for his core argument. Military adaptation isn't just about, buying shiny new weapons or casually updating a training manual. It's a biological imperative. Adapting to a constantly shifting, dangerous environment is quite literally a matter of survival. Adapt or die, right?
To see this in action, just look at the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. It is an absolute masterclass in contrasts. On one side, you had Russia's pre-2022 rigid structural reforms just struggling to gain any ground. And on the flip side, that clashed head-on with Ukraine's incredibly dynamic, post-2014 battlefield adaptation. We're talking about Ukraine rapidly updating tactics, literally duct-taping Western equipment to old Soviet-era gear, and ingeniously deploying commercial drones. It's just a vivid, real-time demonstration of adaptation and counter-adaptation.
And the shockwaves from that conflict, they were massive. Think about this, 100 billion euros. That's the unprecedented modernization fund Germany announced for the Bundeswehr in direct response to the conflict. It just goes to show that military change isn't some abstract theory. It forces nations to completely upend their defense structures and budgets practically overnight.
Moving right along to Section 2, the challenge of change, looking closely at the internal battles.
Because to truly understand how hard this is, we have to look at internal resistance. A perfect impartial case study is the 2022 controversy surrounding the U.S. Marine Corps. Specifically, we're talking about Commandant General David Berger's Force Design 2030. This was a massive internal reform initiative that sparked an intense, highly public debate.
The friction here was incredibly clear. General Berger wanted a drastic transformation. He wanted to abandon heavy tanks entirely, to focus on nimble, amphibious assaults and precision munitions tailored for a potential Pacific confrontation. But on the other hand, around 30 former generals pushed back hard. They aggressively lobbied Congress and wrote op-eds to protect the traditional identity of the Corps, fighting to keep those tanks and helicopters. It perfectly illustrates how strategic, cultural, and political dimensions all intertwine to make military reform, incredibly messy.
Let's shift gears to Section 3, Anatomy of Military Strategy, where we dive into the academic frameworks. So, to get on the same page, Olivier Schmitt defines military change as the specific modalities and processes by which armed forces evolve that affect their operational effectiveness. Now, why does that academic definition actually matter? Because it highlights a constant, brutal tug-of-war. A military has to maintain organizational stability so it actually has a predictable fighting force, but at the exact same time, it has to frantically adapt to a strategic context that simply refuses to stay still.
If you think about it, military strategy is actually a really careful balancing act between three things. First, operational strategy, which directs how forces fight. Second, declaratory strategy, which is all about sending signals to allies and enemies. But the third piece, and what we're really focusing on today, is the strategy of means. That's the gritty reality of figuring out exactly what kind of forces are going to be funded, built, and made available in the first place.
Which brings us nicely to Section 4, Innovation versus Adaptation. This is all about how armies actually evolve on the ground.
Adam Grissom's taxonomy of military change is just a fantastic framework for mapping all this out. It basically asks two simple questions. First, where is the change happening? Is it at the top state level, the service level, or down in the field? And second, when is it happening? Are we watching deliberate strategic innovation driven by leadership during peacetime, or is it that frantic horizontal adaptation by soldiers out in the mud during a war?
The historian Williamson Murray captures this core paradox so brilliantly. He points out that in peacetime, an innovator might lack significant resources, but hey, they have time. In combat, it is the exact opposite. Out there, they possess a plethora of resources, but time is absolutely not one of them. It all boils down to this wild paradox. Peacetime gives you all the time in the world but no money, while wartime gives you endless resources but absolutely zero time to figure things out.
And finally, we arrive at Section 5, the trillion-dollar future, looking at the immense global pressures ahead.
Look, military change is an immensely, almost incomprehensibly expensive global priority. In 2024, total global military spending reached a jaw-dropping $2.46 trillion, with the US alone nearing $1 trillion and nations like China and India pouring in massive funds as well. Understanding the mechanics of military change isn't just an academic exercise. It's really the only way for citizens and leaders to assess if this massive global spending is actually keeping us safe or if it's just bureaucratic waste.
But here's the kicker. All that money is going up against some truly unavoidable megatrends. We are talking about the cascading consequences of climate change, the absolute exponential explosion of artificial intelligence, massive planetary urbanization, and globally aging populations. These are the invisible, long-term systems and pressures that will totally dictate how armed forces must structurally transform over the next decade.
So, as we watch the world rapidly shift around us, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. How can massive, rigid, traditional organizations possibly prepare for these invisible systems and megatrends before the next conflict even begins? Time might be the one resource they just can't buy. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning how the structures of power around us are evolving. See you next time.